Can you even cook? That's what my mother-in-law said to me at Thanksgiving dinner, 2019, in front of 14 people. She didn't whisper it. She didn't lean over and murmur it like some quiet aside. She said it across the table, over the turkey I had spent 6 hours preparing, loud enough that my husband's Uncle Gerald heard it from the living room and laughed. She picked up her fork, pushed a piece of sweet potato around her plate, and added, "I mean, really cook, not this." 14 people at that table. My husband sat 3 chairs down. He heard her. He cut his meat and said nothing. Here's the thing she didn't know. Here's what none of them knew that November evening in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, while they picked apart my cooking and my choices, and the way I kept my hair too short for a woman. 3 weeks earlier, I had been standing in a classified briefing room at the Pentagon, delivering a logistics assessment to a room that included 2 brigadier generals and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. I was the youngest person in that room by 11 years. I was the only woman. And when I finished speaking, a 3-star general named Raymond Avery, a man whose name most of these dinner guests would never be important enough to hear, looked at me across the table and said, "Captain Vasquez, that's the clearest threat resource analysis I've seen in 18 months. I want you on my planning team." My mother-in-law didn't know about that. My husband did. He'd read the email I forwarded him that night, the one where I told him what happened, how my hands had been shaking under the table, and I steadied them by pressing my palms flat against my thighs. He'd replied with one word: "Cool. Cool." So when Patricia Hendricks, née Patricia Ann Whitfield of Raleigh, North Carolina, looked at me over my own turkey in my own dining room on a base where I had earned the right to live, and asked if I could even cook, I did what I always did. I set my fork down quietly, I smiled, and I said, "I'll make a note to do better next year, Patricia." My name is Elena Vasquez. I was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1990. My mother cleaned rooms at the hotel and spa at the Hilton Garden Inn on East University Avenue, and my father drove long-haul freight for a company that went bankrupt when I was 12. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house with 5 people in it and 1 bathroom that worked. I joined the United States Army at 18 because a recruiter at Mayfield High School told me I tested in the top 2% on the ASVAB, and I could do something with that. Or I could stay in Las Cruces and watch it mean nothing. I chose to do something with it. This is the story of how I spent 9 years letting people who never sacrificed anything tell me I wasn't enough. How I built something real while they laughed. And how, on one very specific afternoon in a courtroom in Cumberland County, North Carolina, every single one of them learned what I was actually worth. But I need to go back. I need to tell you about my grandfather first, because without him, none of this makes sense. His name was Tomas Vasquez. He was a welder, 41 years at the same shop in Las Cruces, a place called Romero Iron Works on South Solano Drive that doesn't exist anymore. They tore it down in 2015 and put up a Walgreens. He had hands like leather gloves left out in the sun. Thick, cracked, dark from decades of spark burns that healed over each other until the skin on his knuckles looked like terrain on a map. He never raised his voice, not once that I can remember. When I was angry, when I came home crying from school because someone said something about my clothes or my lunch or my mother's accent, he would sit on the porch with me and wait. He never rushed me. He never told me to stop crying. He'd just wait until I was done, and then he'd say the same thing every time. "Mija, a quiet woman with a plan will always beat a loud man with an opinion." I must have heard him say that 50 times before he died. It became the kind of thing you stop hearing because it's so familiar, like a clock ticking. You only notice it when it stops. He died in 2017, 2 years before that Thanksgiving dinner. Lung complications from decades of welding fumes. The shop never provided proper ventilation. he never complained. I flew home from Fort Hood on emergency leave, and I sat next to his hospital bed at Mountain View Regional Medical Center for 3 days. On the last night, he couldn't really talk anymore, but he grabbed my wrist. His grip was still strong. Absurdly strong for a man whose lungs were shutting down. He looked at me, and I could see him trying to say something. His lips moved. No sound came out. I leaned in close enough to smell the antiseptic on his skin and the faint trace of metal that never left him. Not even there, not even at the end. "You already know," he whispered. "You already know what to do." He died the next morning at 6:14 a.m. I was holding his hand. It was still warm for a long time after. I carried those words back to Fort Hood. I carried them through my transfer to Fort Bragg. I carried them into my marriage, which by then was already beginning to feel like a room with no windows. And I carried them into that Thanksgiving dinner, where I smiled at Patricia and said I'd do better next year, because my grandfather taught me that silence isn't weakness. Silence is preparation. My name is Clara Bellingham. I was 31 years old when I realized I had spent my entire adult life making myself smaller so other people could feel tall. I need to tell you what I actually did for a living, because it matters. It matters more than anything Patricia ever bothered to ask about. I was a logistics coordination officer at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. That title sounds bureaucratic and dull, and I think that's exactly why nobody in Marcus's family ever asked a follow-up question. But here's what it actually meant. I managed the movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies for the 82nd Airborne Division's rapid deployment operations. When a crisis broke anywhere on Earth and the first boots needed to be on the ground within 18 hours, my team was the reason those boots had ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and functional comms waiting for them when they landed. We coordinated air transport manifests, ground convoy logistics, and supply chain continuity across multiple theaters. I had a security clearance that I couldn't discuss at Thanksgiving dinner. Not that anyone ever asked. I was good at it. Not in the way people say they're good at things to make conversation. I was good at it in the way that got documented. I received a Meritorious Service Medal after coordinating emergency resupply during a humanitarian operation in the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. My commanding officer at the time, Colonel Davis, wrote in my evaluation that I demonstrated, and I'm quoting from memory here, exceptional composure under crisis conditions and an intuitive command of operational logistics that officers of significantly higher rank would envy. Nobody at Patricia's table ever read that evaluation. Nobody ever asked. What they saw was a quiet woman with a soft voice who wore her dark hair pulled back, who had hands that looked too small for the uniform she wore, who smiled politely when spoken to and didn't raise her voice. I'm 5'4". I weigh 128 pounds. I have a scar on my left knee from a training accident in 2011 when a cargo pallet shifted during an airdrop rehearsal and pinned me against a loading rail. The scar is white and raised and shaped like a crescent. It aches when it rains, which in Fayetteville, North Carolina is more often than you'd think. I never limp. I learned not to. My grandfather was the one who taught me that. Not the not limping specifically, but the principle behind it. His name was Harold Bellingham. He served in Korea, came home to Raleigh with a piece of shrapnel still lodged near his spine that no surgeon wanted to touch. He worked 34 years as a machinist at a tool and die shop on Capitol Boulevard. He never once called in sick. He raised my mother alone after my grandmother passed in 1978, and then he helped raise me after my father decided that fatherhood was a hobby he could put down whenever the mood struck. Grandpa Harold had hands like leather gloves filled with walnuts. He smelled like machine oil and Listerine and the particular kind of patience that only comes from decades of being underestimated. He was the smartest person I've ever known, and he never went to college. He read everything: history, science, philosophy, field manuals he borrowed from the VFW. He could rebuild a carburetor and quote Marcus Aurelius in the same afternoon. He had one phrase he said to me more than any other. He said it when I was 12 and crying because the boys in my class said girls couldn't understand math. He said it when I was 18 and scared to enlist. He said it when I was 24 and calling him from a base in Germany at 2 in the morning because I felt invisible. You already know what to do. That was it. Not instructions, not advice. Just a mirror held up so I could see that the answer was already inside me, waiting for me to stop asking permission to use it. The last time he said it was in that hospital room in Raleigh, with the fluorescent lights buzzing and the monitors beeping their slow countdown. I told you about that. What I didn't tell you was what happened the morning after he died. I drove back to his house on Poole Road, let myself in with the key he'd given me when I was 16, and sat in his kitchen. The coffee maker was still set up. He'd measured out the grounds before he went to the hospital, like he expected to come home. I pressed the button and sat there while the machine hissed and gurgled, and the kitchen filled with the smell of the coffee he would never drink. I drank it myself. Black, no sugar, the way he took it. It was too strong. It was perfect. I found the envelope 3 days later, tucked in the back of his filing cabinet behind his discharge papers and a stack of tax returns going back to 1987. But that comes later in this story. Right now, I just need you to understand who I was before everything broke open. I was a woman who had been trained, both by the army and by a man who loved me more than anyone else on this earth, to be precise under pressure, to move quietly, to plan before acting, to never let anyone see the full scope of what I was carrying until the moment it mattered. Marcus used to joke about it. He'd say I was the calmest person he'd ever met, and he didn't always mean it as a compliment. Patricia never saw it as anything at all. She looked at me and saw a woman who couldn't cook a proper turkey. That was fine. Let her see what she wanted to see. The first Thanksgiving after Marcus and I got married was 2011. We hosted it at our apartment in Fayetteville, just off Bragg Boulevard. The kind of place with thin walls and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. I had just gotten back from a deployment rotation 3 weeks earlier. My hands were still peeling from the dry Afghan air, and I had dropped 9 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. But I wanted to do this. I wanted to cook for my husband's family, sit at a table like a normal person, and feel like something other than a staff sergeant running logistics in Kandahar. Patricia arrived 40 minutes early. She didn't knock. She walked in carrying a casserole dish and an expression that said she already knew how the evening was going to go. She set the dish on the counter and looked at my turkey, which was brined and resting in the roasting pan, and she said, without even turning to face me, "That bird looks dry already, sweetheart. Did you remember to butter it?" I had. Underneath the skin, herb compound butter I'd made from scratch, using a recipe my grandfather taught me when I was 15. But I didn't say that. I just said, "Yes, ma'am," and kept working. That was the first time. The second was Christmas 2013. Marcus and I had moved to a better place by then, a little ranch house we were renting near the Linden Oaks neighborhood. I had just been promoted and was carrying more operational weight than I had ever handled. I made a full spread. Honey-glazed ham, collard greens from scratch, cornbread that I baked in a cast-iron skillet my grandfather left me. Patricia brought Marcus's sister Denise and Denise's husband Kevin. When they sat down, Patricia looked at the table and said to Denise, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, let's see if she's improved any." Then she laughed. Denise laughed. Kevin had the decency to look uncomfortable. Marcus said nothing. He squeezed my knee under the table, which I think he believed was support. It wasn't. It was a request for me to stay quiet. I stayed quiet. The third time was the one that left a mark. It was March 2016, and Marcus's father had just passed. Ernest Williams, 71 years old, a man who had worked at the GM plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee for 30 years and never once called in sick. The funeral was in Clarksville. I handled the arrangements because Marcus was too broken up to function, and Patricia was too busy telling everyone how broken up she was. I coordinated with the funeral home, the pastor, the caterer. I made sure Ernest's army buddies from the 101st knew the time and place. I printed the programs myself at a FedEx in town at 2 in the morning because the originals had a typo in the scripture verse, and Patricia would have noticed. After the service, there was a reception at the church hall. I had organized the food, a simple buffet, nothing fancy but warm and right. Fried chicken, potato salad, green beans, rolls, sweet tea. Everything labeled, everything timed. People were eating, people were thanking me. And then I heard Patricia talking to her sister near the dessert table. She wasn't whispering. She said, "Janelle means well, but she's not really a kitchen person." I had to practically coach her through the menu. Her sister nodded like this was known information. Like I was a charity case Patricia had been generously tolerating. I was standing 8 feet away holding a tray of peach cobbler I had baked at 4 in the morning while my husband slept in his childhood bed upstairs. Patricia saw me. She knew I heard her. She didn't correct herself, she just smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I dare you to make this a thing right now, at your father-in-law's funeral, in front of 60 people. I set the cobbler down. I went to the bathroom. I locked the door and put both hands on the edge of the sink and breathed for 3 minutes. I didn't cry. I just breathed. The fourth time was the worst because it involved more than just Patricia. It was Thanksgiving 2018, and we were at their house in Clarksville, the big colonial on Madison Street with the wraparound porch. Marcus's brother Derek was there with his wife, and Denise and Kevin, and Patricia's church friends, the Hendersons. I had made my grandfather's sweet potato pie, the one with the bourbon and the hand-torched meringue, the one it takes 4 hours and requires you to temper eggs like you're performing surgery. I brought 2 of them. Patricia had already set out desserts on the sideboard. When I tried to put my pies down, she moved them to a small table in the corner of the living room, away from everything else. She said, "We'll put these over here so people have options." Options. Like they were an afterthought. Like they were something to be polite about. During dinner, Marcus's brother Derek made a joke. He said, "Janelle, you still letting Mom teach you how to cook?" And the table laughed. All of them. The Hendersons laughed. Denise laughed. Patricia laughed loudest of all. That musical laugh she used in public. The one that sounded generous if you didn't know what was underneath it. She said, "Oh, I've been trying. Lord knows I've been trying. Some people just weren't raised around a proper kitchen." She looked at me when she said the word raised. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew my mother left when I was 6. She knew my grandfather raised me alone in a 2-bedroom house with a kitchen the size of a closet. She knew, and she used it. Marcus laughed too. Softly, and he looked away right after, but he laughed. That was the night I drove home alone. Marcus stayed behind because he'd been drinking, and Patricia insisted he take his old room. I drove 2 hours on I-24 in the dark, and I pulled into the driveway of our house, and I sat in the car with the engine off. The neighborhood was dead quiet. There was frost on the windshield, forming in real time. These little crystals spreading slow across the glass like something alive. That was the only time I cried. Not because of the pie, not because of the joke. Because my husband laughed. And in that single sound, I heard exactly how small I was in that family's story. I was the wife who couldn't cook. That was my character. That was my role. and everyone, including the man who was supposed to stand next to me, had agreed to it so completely that they didn't even notice it was cruel. I sat in that car for 40 minutes. The frost kept spreading until I couldn't see out of any window, and it was like being inside a cocoon, sealed off from everything. My breath made these small clouds that disappeared almost before I could see them. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped, like even it had given up. And then something happened that I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt, no voice from above, no sudden rage. It was more like a lock clicking open inside my chest. Not loud, just precise. I thought about Grandpa Earl. He'd been gone 4 years by then. Lung cancer took him slow, which was the one injustice I'll never make peace with, because he deserved fast if he had to go at all. But in those last weeks, when he was in the VA hospital in Murfreesboro, and I was driving down every other day because Marcus said he was too busy with a case, Grandpa Earl said something I almost missed. His voice was barely there by then, like someone talking through a wall. He said, "Claire, the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift. They're telling you exactly how much room you have to move before they'll even think to look." I remember I squeezed his hand and told him I loved him, and I thought it was the morphine talking. It sounded like something from a fortune cookie. But sitting in that frozen car on Birchwood Lane at 11:40 at night on Thanksgiving, I heard it again. Not like a memory, like he was sitting in the passenger seat saying it fresh, and I understood it differently. For 9 years I had been collecting room. 9 years of them not looking. 9 years of being underestimated so thoroughly that nobody in that family had any idea what I actually did all day, what I was capable of, what I had built, what I knew. Patricia thought I worked in a kitchen. Marcus probably told them that, or let them believe it. My actual title at that point was Deputy Director of Nutritional Sciences and Operational Readiness at Fort Campbell. And I had a security clearance, and I managed a team of 14, and I had briefed a 2-star general the previous spring on caloric sustainability models for extended field operations. None of them knew, because none of them had ever asked. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the frosted interior of the car in this pale blue glow. I opened my contacts, and I scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 2 years. Denise Wakefield. She was a JAG attorney I'd met during a joint briefing at Campbell, and we'd had coffee twice, and she'd given me her card and said, "If you ever need anything." People say that all the time and don't mean it. But Denise had looked at me with this particular steadiness when she said it, like she could see something coming that I couldn't yet. I didn't call her that night. It was nearly midnight, but I saved her number to my favorites. That was the first concrete thing I did, not out of anger, out of clarity. The second thing I did was go inside and open my laptop at the kitchen table. Marcus wouldn't be home until the next afternoon. The house was perfectly still. I made myself a cup of the good green tea, the one I kept in the back of the cabinet that nobody else touched, and I sat down and I started writing. Not a letter, not a plan, just facts. I wrote down everything I had contributed financially to our marriage in 9 years. Every deposit, every bill I'd split, the down payment on this house, which had come from my savings because Marcus's student loans were still heavy when we bought it. The car I'd paid off for him when he made junior partner because he said the old one didn't look right for client meetings. The $6,000 I'd sent Patricia directly, not through Marcus, when she needed her roof done after the storms in 2019, and nobody else in the family stepped up. I wrote it all down in a spreadsheet, dollar amounts, dates. I had records for almost everything because the Army teaches you to document. You document meals served, calories per unit, supply chain variances down to the ounce. I had applied that same discipline to my personal finances without even realizing its significance until that moment. When I finished, the total was just over $140,000 in direct financial contributions beyond my share of normal expenses. $140,000 from the woman who couldn't cook. I closed the laptop. I washed my teacup. I dried it and put it back exactly where it belonged. Then I went to bed in our room, in the center of the mattress, and I slept 7 unbroken hours for the first time in months. When I woke up the next morning, the frost had melted, and the sun was coming through the bedroom window in these clean, straight lines across the floor. I lay there for maybe 5 minutes looking at the light. I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. It was the absence of hoping. I had stopped hoping that Marcus would see me. I had stopped hoping that Patricia would respect me. I had stopped hoping that the next holiday or the next year or the next kind gesture would be the one that finally changed the equation. Hope had kept me patient. Removing it made me free. I didn't tell Marcus anything when he came home that afternoon, smelling like Patricia's coffee and leftover bourbon. He kissed me on the forehead and said, "You missed a good breakfast this morning. Mom made her cinnamon rolls." I said, "That sounds nice." He didn't notice anything different. Of course he didn't. That was the gift. The following Monday, I called Denise Wakefield from my office during lunch. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Denise, it's Claire Aldridge. We met at Campbell a couple years ago." She said, "I remember you. The nutritional sciences briefing. You were the sharpest person in that room." I almost laughed. She asked what she could do for me. I said, "I need to understand my options." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Come see me Thursday. Bring everything you have. And Claire, bring copies, not originals." That was how it started. Not with a shout. With a Thursday appointment and a cup of green tea and a spreadsheet that told a story nobody had bothered to read. I drove to Denise's office in Alexandria that Thursday morning with a canvas tote bag on the passenger seat. Inside it were 14 manila folders, each one labeled with a date range and a category. Financial contributions, property records, deployment schedules cross-referenced with household expenditures, tax returns going back 9 years, credit card statements showing who paid for what and when. I had printed everything on the laser printer at the post library the previous Saturday while Richard was at the golf course with Major Fenton, and I had done it slowly, checking each page, because Nana Marguerite's voice was in my head saying, "Copies, not originals." And Denise's voice was in my head saying the same thing, and when two women from different decades tell you the same thing, you listen. Denise Wakefield practiced family law out of a narrow brownstone 3 blocks from the King Street metro station. Her office smelled like lemon furniture polish and old radiator heat. She had reading glasses on a chain and a handshake that meant business, and she did not waste a single minute on small talk. She cleared her desk, I set the folders down, and for 2 hours she read while I sat in the leather chair across from her and drank green tea from a mug that said, "Justice is patient." When she finished, she took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose and said, "Claire, do you know what you have here?" I said, "I think so." She said, "You funded the down payment on the Fayetteville house, the renovation of the kitchen and the 2 bathrooms, 3 years of his truck payments while he was deployed, and the entire balance of the family emergency fund, which he drew on twice without telling you. She said all of this while your name was not on the deed." I said, "That's correct." She said, "And the nutritional consulting work you did for his unit and 2 adjacent units, the meal programming, the field ration improvement project, that was unpaid." I said, "Yes, volunteer basis through the Family Readiness Group." She nodded slowly. She said, "The Army does not compensate spouses for that kind of work, but a court can consider it when evaluating contribution to a service member's career advancement." She said especially when the service member received a commendation that specifically cited the nutritional programming you designed. I had not known about the commendation. Richard never mentioned it. Denise showed me a copy she had pulled from a publicly accessible database. There it was. A letter of commendation from Brigade Command, dated 14 months earlier, praising Lieutenant Colonel Aldridge for implementing an innovative field nutrition program that improved unit readiness metrics by 11%. My program. My research. My early mornings in that kitchen testing calorie-dense recipes that could survive a rucksack and still taste like someone cared. Denise asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted what was fair. She said fair is a word that means different things to different people, and her job was to make it mean something specific and enforceable. I liked her very much in that moment. Over the next 3 months, I drove to Alexandria 6 more times. Each visit was on a weekday when Richard was on post. I scheduled them during his regular briefing blocks because he never checked his phone during briefings, and he never asked what I did during the day. That was the pattern working in my favor now. Years of being invisible meant I could move without being seen. Denise and I built the case piece by piece. She brought in a forensic accountant named Gerald who wore suspenders and spoke in exact numbers. Gerald traced the money flows and put them into a format a judge would understand. He said you essentially subsidized his career for a decade. He said it like he was reading a weather report. I appreciated that. No outrage, just numbers. I also contacted Brenda Hayes at the Pentagon dining facility where I had developed the allergy-safe menu system 2 years before. Brenda remembered everything. She said, "Claire, we still use your system. It's become the model for 3 other installations." She said she would put that in writing. She did. 3 pages, on letterhead, with specifics. During those months, Richard continued as if nothing were changing. He came home, ate the dinners I made, told me about his day in the clipped, efficient way he always did, and never once asked about mine. Once in late February, he looked at me across the table and said, "You seem quiet." I said, "I'm fine." He said, "Well, good." He went back to his phone. His mother, Donna, called every Sunday. She still made her little comments. "How is your garden going, Claire? You know Richard always did prefer a woman who could keep a nice home." I said, "The garden's doing well, Donna." She said, "That's sweet." That was the extent of her curiosity about me. The hardest part was not the legal work. It was the restraint. There were nights I wanted to lay every folder on the kitchen table and say, "Look! Look at what I found! Look at what you never bothered to see!" But Denise had told me patience was not just a virtue in family law. It was a strategy. She said the moment you reveal your hand early is the moment the other side starts hiding assets. She said, "Let him be comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes." So I let him be comfortable. I cooked his meals. I attended the spouse events. I smiled at Donna. I drove to Alexandria and came home, and no one ever asked where I had been, because no one ever asked where I was going. The invisibility that had hurt me for years became the only armor I needed. The evening started at 6:30. Fort Myer Officers Club. The big room with the cream curtains and the brass fixtures and the long tables dressed in white linen. Retirement ceremony for Colonel Harold Vance, 28 years of service, a man who had mentored half the logistics command at one point or another. Gerald had been invited because Harold had been his first battalion commander. I had been invited because Gerald needed someone to sit beside him and laugh at the right moments. I wore a navy dress I had bought at a consignment shop in Falls Church. Simple. No jewelry except my mother's pearl earrings. I had my hair pulled back and my shoes were low and quiet on the hardwood floor. I looked like what they expected me to look like. That was the point. Gerald was already 2 bourbons in by the time we sat down. He was loud, the way he got when he wanted the table to know he mattered. He had his arm around the back of my chair, but he was not touching me. He was talking to Major Dan Ostrowski about a supply chain problem in Grafenvohr and making it sound like he had personally solved it. Dan was nodding along. Dan always nodded along. Donna was 3 seats down, in a red dress that fit her like she had been sewn into it. She caught my eye once and gave me that smile, the one that said, "I know something you do not." She had no idea how right she was, just not in the direction she imagined. The ceremony itself was brief and warm. Harold Vance stood at the podium and thanked his wife of 31 years, and she cried and everyone clapped. Then there were toasts. Then dinner, chicken or fish. I had the fish. It was overcooked, and the lemon was decorative. I ate it slowly and said nothing. It was during the dessert course that things changed. I had not planned it for that evening. That is the truth. Denise and I had a timeline, and the retirement dinner was not on it. But sometimes the world arranges itself without your permission. Brigadier General Catherine Morse was at the head table. I knew her name. Everyone knew her name. She was the first woman to command a logistics brigade in theater, and she had done it during the initial push into Iraq with a supply line that stretched 1,100 miles through hostile territory. She was small, maybe 5'4", with silver hair cut close and a voice that could fill a stadium without rising above conversation level. She was there because Harold Vance had served under her in Kuwait. After the dessert plates were cleared, General Morse stood and walked to the microphone. She said she wanted to add a few words beyond the official remarks. The room went quiet. When a general stands, a room listens. She talked about Harold for a minute or two. Then she said something that made the blood leave Gerald's face. She said she had recently been reviewing nominations for the Department of the Army Civilian Service Award, and that while this was not the formal venue, she wanted to acknowledge someone in the room whose work had come to her attention through a mutual colleague. She said the name Elaine Kowalski. My name. She said it clearly, looking directly at me. Gerald's fork stopped halfway between his plate and his mouth. I could hear the tines scrape the porcelain when he set it back down. General Morse explained that she had been forwarded a copy of a logistical analysis I had written 3 years ago, a paper on cold-chain pharmaceutical distribution in forward operating bases, which I had submitted to a military logistics journal under my own name. She said it had been cited in a Pentagon Working Group report on medical supply reform. She said it was one of the most practical and thoroughly researched papers she had read in 20 years. I had not known about the Pentagon citation. I had submitted that paper during a period when Gerald was deployed, and I had time to think. I had used my maiden name. I had never mentioned it to him because he had never asked what I did with my time. General Morse asked me to stand. I stood. My knees were solid. My hands were still. The room applauded. Not the polite applause of obligation. Real applause. The kind that comes with turned heads and genuine surprise. Gerald clapped too. He had to. But his face was the color of old paper, and I could see his jaw working, the muscle pulsing near his ear, the way it did when he was processing something that did not fit the world as he had arranged it. Donna was not clapping. She was staring at me with her lips slightly parted, like she was trying to read a sign in a language she did not speak. After I sat back down, Gerald leaned over and whispered, "What paper?" Just that, what paper? Not congratulations, not I did not know about this, not tell me more. What paper? As if I had hidden a weapon in the house. I said, "I will tell you later." My voice was level, almost warm. General Morse returned to her seat and the evening continued, but the room had shifted. People who had never spoken to me were stopping by our table. A lieutenant colonel from the medical command asked me about cold chain protocols, and I answered him precisely, with data, with specifics, with the calm detail of someone who had been thinking about this for years while peeling carrots and folding laundry. Gerald sat very still through all of it. He finished his bourbon. He ordered another. He did not put his arm back around my chair. At 9:15, as the evening began to thin out, Donna walked over. She stood next to Gerald and looked at me and said, "Well, I guess you are full of surprises." She said it with a laugh, the kind meant to reduce what had just happened to a cute anomaly. Then she said, "Can you even cook? Because with all that research, I would think the kitchen would suffer." She laughed again. A few people nearby smiled uncomfortably. I looked at her for a long moment. I did not smile. I did not frown. I said, "The kitchen is fine, Donna. Everything is fine. You will see." She stopped laughing. Something in my tone, maybe. Something in the stillness of my face. Gerald drove us home in silence. The Beltway was empty, the Potomac black and flat under the bridge lights. He gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2 and did not look at me once. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine and sat there. He said, "How long have you been doing this behind my back?" I said, "Doing what?" "Writing, thinking, having a mind." He did not answer. He got out of the car and went inside, and I sat in the passenger seat for another 3 minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The oak tree in the front yard was bare. The porch light was on. The house looked the same as it always had. But it was not the same, and he knew it. And I knew he knew it. And that knowledge, sitting quiet and certain in my chest, was worth more than anything he had ever given me. The next morning, Keith left for work without saying goodbye. I heard the garage door open at 6:15, the engine of his Tahoe, the garage door closing again. No coffee left in the pot. No note. Just the silence of a man recalculating. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands around a mug and waited for the phone to ring. It took until noon. His mother called first, Diane. She had always been polite to me in the way people are polite to furniture they did not choose but have learned to tolerate. She said Keith told her what happened at the dinner. She said she was confused. She said she did not understand why I would embarrass him like that in front of his colleagues. I said, "Diane, I did not embarrass him. A 3-star general asked me a question and I answered it." She said, "Well, you could have been more modest about it." I said, "Modest about what? About working, about being competent, about existing as something other than Keith's wife who makes the potato salad." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you need to consider how this affects your marriage." I said, "I have been considering that for 14 years. She hung up. Keith's brother called that evening. Troy, who ran a flooring company in Manassas and had once told me at Thanksgiving that women in the military was the reason morale was declining. Troy said he heard I'd made a scene. I said, "Troy, I am not going to discuss my professional life with you." He said, "See, that's the attitude right there." I hung up. The calls kept coming over the next 2 weeks. Keith's aunt, his college roommate's wife, a cousin I had met once at a baptism. Each one had a slightly different version of the story, each one more distorted than the last. In one version, I had stood up and given an unsolicited speech. In another, I had contradicted a colonel in public. In the most creative version, I had flirted with General Morrison to get attention. None of them asked me what actually happened. None of them asked to read the paper. But other calls came too, quieter ones. A colonel named Rodriguez from the logistics division left a voicemail saying he had read the full version of my analysis and wanted to discuss implementation. A woman named Patel from the Pentagon's Office of Cost Assessment sent an email, formal and precise, asking if I would be willing to present to her team. The deputy at the Rand Corporation, a man I had never met, forwarded my paper to 3 people and copied me with a note that said simply, "This is the clearest thinking I have seen on this problem in a decade." The professional world moved forward. My kitchen stayed frozen. Keith and I did not fight. That would have required him to acknowledge what had changed. Instead, he simply subtracted. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped eating dinner at the table, taking his plate to the living room where the television was always on. He stopped touching my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. Small erasures, one after another, as if he could undo what had happened by removing himself from the ordinary moments of our life. 3 weeks after the dinner, I received a formal offer. A consulting contract with the Department of Defense, routed through a firm in Arlington. The pay was almost exactly what Keith made as a GS-14. When I told him, he looked at the letter for a long time and then set it down on the counter and said, "Do what you want." I signed it the next day. The following Sunday, we went to his parents' house in Fredericksburg for his father's birthday. Diane had made a ham. The whole family was there. Troy and his wife, Keith's sister Lauren and her husband, the cousins, the kids running through the yard. I brought a salad and a bottle of wine, and I wore a blue dress, and I walked in knowing exactly what was waiting for me. It was Lauren who said it first. She was leaning against the kitchen island holding a glass of sweet tea, and she looked at me and said, "So I hear you're some kind of military genius now." She smiled when she said it, but the smile did not reach past her teeth. I said, "I'm a logistics analyst." She said, "Well, Keith says you're never home anymore." I said, "Keith is home every evening at 5:30. I am home by 6. That is 30 minutes, Lauren." Troy jumped in from the doorway. He said, "The problem is you're trying to be something you're not." He said it casually, the way he said everything, as if his opinions were weather, just facts falling from the sky. I looked at him. I said, "Troy, what am I trying to be?" He said, "You know, important." The room was quiet. Diane was at the stove. Keith was somewhere in the back of the house. His father was sitting in the recliner in the next room, and I could see the side of his face, his jaw working slowly, listening. I set my glass down on the counter. I said, "I am not trying to be important. I have been important. For 14 years, I have run the logistics of this family. Every birthday, every medical appointment, every school registration, every tax return, every single Thanksgiving, including this ham, which Diane makes from my mother's recipe that I gave her in 2011. I have been important every single day. The only thing that changed is that someone outside this family finally noticed." Nobody spoke. Lauren looked at her tea. Troy scratched the back of his neck. Then Keith's father spoke from the next room. He did not raise his voice. He said, "She's right, you know." He said, "I watched her do it. All of it." He said, "You all should be ashamed of yourselves." I had never heard him say anything like that. In 14 years, he had been kind but distant, a man of few words who nodded and passed the rolls and fell asleep during football games. He looked at me through the doorway with eyes that were tired and clear, and he gave me one small nod. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was real, and I felt it land somewhere deep in my chest, in the place where my grandfather's voice still lived. And I held it there, carefully, the way you hold something you have waited a very long time to receive. The weeks after the ceremony moved strangely. Time had a different texture, like fabric that had been washed so many times it finally became soft. I went back to Fort Bragg on Monday morning and sat at my desk and opened the same spreadsheets and answered the same emails, and nothing had changed, except that everything had changed, because I had changed. Keith called 4 times in the first week. I let 3 of them go to voicemail. On the 4th, I picked up, because it was late and I was tired, and there is something about 11 o'clock at night that makes you answer phones you should not answer. He said he wanted to talk. He said he had been thinking. He said maybe they had not always been fair to me. I noticed the word maybe. I noticed the word always. Even now, even after the general had spoken my name and the colonel had shaken my hand and a room full of people had stood for me, Keith could not say it plainly. He could only circle it, the way you circle a parking lot when you do not actually want to go inside the store. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I hoped he was doing well. I told him I had to go because I had an early morning, which was true, and I hung up and sat in my kitchen in the apartment I had rented after the divorce, the one with the small patio that faced east so I could drink coffee in the morning sun, and I thought about my grandfather. He had died in March of 2014, pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal, the way that disease always is. I drove to Fayetteville from Bragg every evening for the last 3 weeks of his life, and sat beside his bed in the house he had built with his own hands in 1971, the house with the porch that creaked and the kitchen that smelled like coffee and bacon grease no matter how many times you cleaned it. He was thin by then. His hands, those enormous hands that had held mine when I was 5, were pale and light on the blanket. One evening, near the end, he looked at me and his eyes were sharp, the way they sometimes got, cutting through the morphine haze like headlights through fog, and he said the thing I have carried with me every day since. He said, "Claire." He said, "The world is going to tell you that quiet means weak." He said, "You remember that a bullet is quiet too, right up until it hits." I laughed because it was such a him thing to say, violent and tender at the same time. He smiled and closed his eyes, and 2 days later he was gone, and I stood at his grave in my dress uniform with my hands clasped behind my back, and I did not cry because he would not have wanted that, not there, not in front of people. I cried later, in my car, in the parking lot of the Waffle House on Skibo Road, at 1 in the morning, with the engine running and the heat on because it was still cold in March in North Carolina. I cried until my ribs hurt, and then I drove home and washed my face and went to bed and got up at 05:30 and went back to work because that is what you do. That is what he taught me to do. Now, sitting in my kitchen all these years later, I understood his words differently than I had before. When he said them, I thought he was telling me to be patient, to wait, to endure. And maybe that was part of it, but the part I missed, the part I did not understand until I stood in that ballroom and watched the faces of people who had dismissed me for years, was that he was also telling me something about aim. A bullet is quiet, yes, but it is also precise. It does not scatter. It does not beg. It knows exactly where it is going, and it goes there, and when it arrives, there is no question about what just happened. I had been precise. Not because I planned some grand revenge, not because I sat in a dark room plotting the downfall of people who mocked my cooking and forgot my rank. I was precise because I did my work honestly, every single day, for years, and I documented it, and I did not let anyone erase it. That is all. It is not dramatic. It will not make a good movie. But it is the truth. And the truth, I have learned, does not need to be dramatic. It just needs to be true. I think about whether I waited too long. I do. I think about the years I spent driving to holiday dinners knowing what was coming, bringing dishes that no one would credit to me, smiling through jokes that were not really jokes. I think about the 14 years of marriage where I folded myself smaller and smaller to fit into a space that was never designed to hold me. And I wonder if my grandfather, had he lived, would have told me to leave sooner. I think he might have. I think he would have sat on that porch and looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "Claire, quiet is good, but silence is different. Silence is when you stop telling yourself the truth." He would have been right. I was silent for too long. I confused endurance with acceptance. I told myself I was being strong when really I was being still. And those are not the same thing. Strength moves. Strength decides. Strength looks at a situation that is not working and says, "This is not working," and walks towards something better, even when the walking is hard and the road is not clear, and everyone behind you is saying, "Where do you think you are going?" I do not hate Key. I do not hate his mother, or his sister, or Troy, or any of them. They are not villains. They are people who got comfortable with a story they told about me and never checked to see if it was true. That is a very human thing to do. I have probably done it to someone else without knowing. We all build our little myths about the people around us, and we furnish those myths with the details that suit us, and we never ask the person inside the myth whether they agree with the decoration. But I am done living inside someone else's story about who I am. That is what the ceremony gave me. Not validation. I had validated myself long before that night. What it gave me was visibility. For one evening, in one room, the world saw what I had always known. And I will not pretend that did not matter. It did. My grandfather would say it should not matter what other people see. And he would be partly right. But he would also be partly wrong because we are social creatures, and recognition is not vanity. Sometimes it is just someone finally saying, "I see you," and meaning it. So I will say this, and then I will be done. It is a Tuesday evening in late October, and I am sitting on the back porch of my house in Fayetteville. The one I bought with my own savings 4 years ago. The little craftsman bungalow on Maiden Lane with the creaky third step and the magnolia tree that drops its waxy leaves all over the yard every autumn. I have a glass of sweet tea in my hand, and the ice has mostly melted because I have been sitting here longer than I intended. The sky is that particular shade of bruised violet that North Carolina does better than anywhere else I have been stationed. And I have been stationed in 11 places across 3 continents, so I feel qualified to judge. The street is quiet. A neighbor's dog barks twice and then gives up. Somewhere down the block, a kid is bouncing a basketball on a driveway. That hollow, rhythmic thump that sounds like a heartbeat if you let your mind go soft enough. The air smells like pine needles and someone's dryer sheets, and the very faint ghost of a charcoal grill that was used hours ago and is now just cooling ash. I think about my grandfather. Not the version of him that everyone quotes at funerals, not the wise old man with the perfect sentences. The real one. The one who burned toast every single morning and then scraped it over the sink with a butter knife and ate it anyway because he refused to waste food. The one who wore the same gray cardigan until it had holes in both elbows, and my grandmother had to sneak it out of the house to throw it away, and he noticed within an hour and fished it out of the trash can and sewed the elbows himself with thread that did not match. The one who told me the thing about silence and kitchens, and who I thought was talking about patience, but who I now understand was talking about something much harder. He was talking about the willingness to be underestimated for a very long time and to let that underestimation become the room in which you do your most important work. Silence is just patience with a spine. That is what he said. I have carried that sentence for over 20 years, and it has changed shape in my hands so many times. When I was young, it felt like permission to be quiet. When I was in my 30s, it felt like a strategy. Now, at 44, it feels like a description of something I no longer need to do. Because I have spoken. Not loudly, not vengefully, but clearly. And the people who needed to hear it, heard it. My mother called me last week. Not to apologize exactly. My mother does not apologize in the traditional sense. She called and she talked about the weather in Elizabethtown for 11 minutes, and then she said, "Your father and I saw a cooking show on television last night, and your father said he wondered whether they season the way you do, and I said, probably not." And that was it. That was as close as she will come. And I decided, sitting in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear, that it was close enough. Not because I do not deserve a full, honest reckoning, I do, but because I know my mother, and I know the architecture of her limitations, and I know that those 11 minutes about the weather were her walking as far toward me as her legs could carry her. I will meet her there. Not all the way, but there. My brother has not called. I do not expect him to. Derek is building his own story about what happened, and in his version, I am sure he is the one who was wronged, and the ceremony was some kind of political theater, and the family was fine before I made it complicated. He will believe this because he needs to believe it, and I have learned that you cannot take a story away from someone who is using it to hold themselves together. You just step out of their story and into your own. I take a sip of the watered-down tea. It is barely sweet anymore, just cold and faintly amber. I set the glass on the arm of the chair and I watch a single leaf detach from the magnolia tree and drift down in that slow, lazy spiral that leaves do when there is no wind to rush them. It lands on the grass without a sound. I think about all the meals I have cooked in all the kitchens I have worked in, the field kitchens in Kandahar, where the heat made the metal surfaces too hot to touch with bare hands. The cramped galley at Fort Campbell, where I learned to feed 400 people in 90 minutes. The competition kitchen in Washington, where I plated that dish with hands that should have been shaking, but were not. All those meals, thousands of them, each one a small proof of something that should never have required proof. Can you even cook? That is what they said. And the answer was always yes. The answer was yes before anyone asked, and it was yes while they were laughing, and it was yes when a 3-star general said my name into a microphone, and it is yes now, tonight, on this porch, with no audience at all. If you are listening to this, and you are the one in the kitchen that no one watches, the one whose work disappears into other people's comfort and is never named, I want you to hear me. You are not invisible. You are just surrounded by people who have not yet learned to look. And that is their failure, not yours. Keep cooking. Keep building. Keep doing the quiet, exact work that only you know the full weight of. One day someone will look, and what they see will take their breath, and you will stand there, calm, because you always knew. The porch light flickers once and then holds steady. The basketball down the street has stopped. It is just me and the magnolia tree and the last thin light draining out of the sky and the sound of my own breathing, which is even and slow and mine. I finish the tea. I go inside. I lock the door behind me, and tomorrow morning I will get up early and I will walk into my kitchen and I will cook.